Welcome friends of Real Motion Comics. Welcome to this 15-minute long, speed animated step-by-step tutorial how I create an animated comic cover. For this little project I picked a comic cover from one of my favorite artists, Hellboy by Mike Mignola. Not only because I like the style, but also because the image's clear composition and flat shading make it pretty easy to work with. Basically, the rule is, the more realistic and detailed a drawing style is, the more work it takes later to cut out and animate. Before starting, I create a new file in Photoshop, right at the final resolution or even a bit bigger. That's important because we're working with pixel graphics, and if something is too small once, you can't scale it up cleanly later. Then, I place the comic image on a new layer and rasterize it immediately so I can edit it at all. The first thing I want to do is remove the text on the cover, so we have a clean image that's easier to work with later. Here I just use the basic brush to paint it away. This isn't a perfect retouch job. At first, it's just about clearing the image. I also use the clone stamp or the automatic background fill tool. I save the file as a PSD, and then it's off to Illustrator. If your image is high-res enough and you're not scaling much, you can skip this step entirely and just work pixel-based. Now I open a new workspace in Illustrator and import the PSD file from Photoshop directly. I want to vectorize the image quickly. For this, I open the image trace window and apply an older preset I made for similar projects. I won't go into all the settings in detail, because image trace's success depends a lot on the source material and your fine-tuning with the given options, and also how much work you want to put into working out smaller errors in the picture by hand, which almost always appear during this process. Especially with realistic or finely shaded images, it often doesn't work that well, and you always lose a bit of the original look when tracing. Which settings work best you honestly have to test a bit, play with thresholds, and see what fits. I save the result as an I file and send it back to Photoshop for the next step, layering. Now comes the part that requires some patience, layering. First, I scale the imported AI file to the maximum or at least appropriate working size. And maybe a quick tip beforehand. It's always worth making a backup of the original layer. Just duplicate it and put it aside. Especially if you work destructively, meaning deleting stuff directly, a safety net is never wrong. The same for saving your projects often. You never know when your system may fail and break down, and you have to redo much cause some autosave is 30-min old. Then, I roughly cut out all relevant parts of the original image, basically the rough draft of my layer structure. So Hellboy as a whole. Then the background with all its elements like the stone he stands on, or the rock ceiling. Everything immediately gets meaningful names, which helps me a lot later when animating. Now that the rough layers are prepared, I go into detail with familiar tools, lasso tools, brush, clone stamp, eraser, everything that helps to cleanly separate the image. As soon as the first layer is finished, for example the background, I roughly place it back where it was in the original. The rock Hellboy stands on is cut out with the eraser, although I personally prefer the lasso because it's often sharper. And what's not needed anymore gets simply painted over in black. Now it gets really busy. I start working on Hellboy himself. First, I copy him roughly from the mother layer, then split him into individual parts. The axe is a good example here. It's only half drawn, but since it's fairly symmetrical, I just copy and mirror the existing side, retouch a little, and voila! Hellboy has a complete axe. All body parts are roughly marked with the lasso and divided into layers. I start with the head, which I cut out, remove leftovers, and retouch small blemishes with the brush tool, of course with the right color. Then the left arm, eraser, brush, and clone stamp are used here too. The coat is a bit trickier because it consists of several layers. Parts lie behind Hellboy and should move later. Others, like the collar, stay fixed to the body. By the way, I forgot to clean a small corner here. Happens, but errors like that should be avoided as much as possible. Areas belonging to the coat are filled with the paintbrush. Then comes the right arm and finally, the hand with the axe. Important. Think about overlaps. Better cut out a bit larger so it doesn't look strange during animation. The tail is cut out. This was pretty simple here because the motif consists of clear colors without many details. But the more realistic the source, the more work this step takes. Just for perspective, if I spend 4 weeks on a project, 2 to 3 weeks are just this prep work. The animation itself often takes only a few days, editing a day, sound another day. But it's worth it. A real motion comic just feels different, more like a living comic, not just a camera moving over a picture. Finally, a quick check. Everything cleanly layered? Layers sensibly named? Then save, and off to After Effects. I now import the Photoshop file directly into After Effects and choose Composition. Retain layer sizes when opening. That way, all layers stay exactly as I set them up in Photoshop. Now we start with Chapter 4.1, 3D and Parenting. Sounds technical at first, but it's actually pretty logical. Parenting means one layer is linked to another, like a child to a parent. That means when the parent moves, the child automatically follows. Super handy, especially for bodies, where you don't want to animate every movement individually. First, I select all layers in the composition with Command plus A and turn on the 3D layer switch. Bam! Now After Effects treats the layers as 3D objects with depth in space. Why is that important? Only 3D layers can react to things like camera moves or light sources, and that's what gives our animation a cinematic look later. Now the so-called Pick Whip tool comes into play. With it, I link layers together. For example, I drag the head onto the upper body onto the lower body, and so on. One layer can only be linked to one other. While linking layers, I simultaneously move the anchor points. That is the point around which a layer will rotate later. This is super important. If the anchor point is wrong, the head might rotate from somewhere in the forehead, which is really annoying in animation. So better do it carefully right away. Head anchor point on the neck, arms at shoulder height, legs at hips, etc. Next up is the chapter placement, the arrangement of our layers in 3D space. I start by moving the background slightly back on the Z-axis, so further away from the camera. At the same time, I scale it a bit up so it still fills the entire frame. Key shortcuts here: R for rotation and P for position. These are basically the two main tools you use. Highly recommended to memorize them early. Scaling and transparency are often used too. Now I move the Hellboy body layer a bit backwards. Since all parts like head, arms, and legs are linked, they move together. That's the beauty of parenting. You can move the entire character without touching every layer. I also place the Hellboy logo at the top of the frame, and the setup is done. I start with rough blocking of the character animation, basically the basic movement before fine-tuning. I work from big to small, first the body, then details. I assume most know how to set a keyframe, but just briefly for beginners, in After Effects, you set keyframes on the timeline that tell the program, hey, something should change here. For example, rotation, position, or scale of a layer. You click the little stopwatch on the property you want to animate to activate keyframe recording. Then scrub along the timeline and set additional keyframes at roughly regular intervals. Less is more. I only slightly change the rotation so it looks like he's breathing or swaying a bit in the wind. I go through the layers and set rough rotation keyframes for all relevant parts: head, arms, coat, etc. The feet need to stabilize the movement a bit, so I animate them to look like they stay firmly on the rock. A super handy shortcut here, the U key. It shows all properties with keyframes on the current layer. Very helpful to keep track of things, especially if you work with many layers. That completes the rough blocking. Everything moves, nothing too wild, just life added. Next up is the puppet tool. Now comes one of my favorite tools, the puppet tool, sometimes called the pin-up tool in German. I use it to give the coat some movement, like it's slightly blowing in the wind. I place 2 pins as fixed points holding the coat in place, and 2 more pins that I move to bring life in. What does the puppet tool actually do? It lays a mesh, a grid, over your layer, and you can deform this mesh at certain points. You can stretch, squash, or slightly animate parts of your image. But again, less is more. Overdoing it makes things look rubbery, but for small, subtle movements, like wind or breathing, it's gold. A super important tip: when you've set keyframes, select them, right-click, and choose Keyframe Interpolation, Easy Ease. That makes the movement smoother, more natural. You can do this for basically all animations, not just the puppet tool. Next, I animate the upper body, again with the puppet tool. The goal is, it should look like Hellboy is breathing. For such repetitive moves, you could also use expressions or scripts to loop automatically. But here, we keep it basic and manual. I just set inhale and exhale keyframes, then copy and paste as often as needed. Yes, a bit like a caveman, but hey, it works. Next up, the camera. I add a new camera layer to the scene, sticking with the standard camera, no fancy stuff. Now we can fly through our 3D space with it. I enable all stopwatches on the camera, position, orientation, etc., but basically focus on movement. Things like focus pull or depth of field are great for cinematic looks, but beyond this tutorial. In After Effects CS6, I like to use the Unified Camera tool. It's super easy to control right in the canvas. Depending on which mouse button you use, you can rotate, zoom, or pan without fiddling with numbers. For extra 3D effect, you can rotate the image a bit parallax style, meaning foreground moves slightly faster than background. But don't overdo it. Too much looks weird. Just a little bit makes it look more spatial. As the name says, After Effects can, well, do effects. Lots of them. There's hardly anything you can't do in some way. For this tutorial, honestly, I didn't know exactly what to show. There are so many possibilities. So I decided to just put a little swirl effect on the Hellboy title. No particular reason, just so we touch on the topic of effects at least once. The motif is pretty simple, and the tutorial shouldn't get too complex, so I keep the effects part short on purpose. What you should remember: the more effects you add to your layers, the more your computer has to work, especially when rendering previews. Working might slow down, depending on how powerful your machine is. And with that, let's move on to the next chapter, lighting. Lighting is a tricky thing. I've done projects completely without it. The image stays neutral like the original, and sometimes that works too. But if you can light properly, you can lift the entire scene's drama to a new level. In After Effects, light sources behave like in real life. Things closer to the lamp get lit brighter. Things further away get less light. So I shifted all elements slightly. Knee forward a bit, axe hand slightly back, head a bit forward. Small details, but huge difference when light fell off is calculated. Then the actual light comes in. Point lights with controllable cones or ambient lights that light everything evenly. Intensity, fall-off, and color can all be keyframed. But I won't go into detail here because I'm still experimenting a lot myself. In the end, I positioned the light so it looks plausible and shifted the logo in space so it gets more light. And with that, we're done with After Effects. Next up, Premiere for final editing and sound. Bring everything into Premiere. Now we import the finished animation. Yes, you can link 8 projects directly in Premiere without rendering in between. That has the advantage that changes in A update automatically in Premiere. For me, that doesn't always work reliably, so I do it old school. I render a high-quality video file from A and import it as a clip in Premiere. Tip for weaker editing computers: render a smaller preview version of your video, edit with that to keep things smooth, and at the end, replace the source video with the high-res version with just 2 clicks. That improves performance immense. Also, play around with the preview setting if needed. You can pull it down to 1/4 of the original quality and hope it will help enough for you to work. My plan is just a bit of music and a voice speaking. Usually, you have at least an ambience, the dialogue, the sound effects and accents, and the music. Sound mixing is a topic on its own. For a start, just keep these volume levels in mind. Dialogue loud enough but not over, 3 to 8 dB. Music and effects audible but not overpowering the dialogue. I roughly align the music to the visuals. Then it's time to render the finished video.
One thing I can't stand is someone wasting good booze. Damn crime is what it is.
So, that's it. I hope you could take something away from this. Maybe some new tricks, or at least a sense of how to approach a motion comic step by step. Sure, I work very manually and often using the easiest methods. Nowadays, there are probably tons of AI-powered tools to do some of these things faster, or maybe even better. But honestly, I'm not really too familiar with them yet. And in the end, my goal here was to show how to understand the basics, so you know what is happening before you hand over the work to machines. If you're interested, feel free to check out my channel. There's more motion comics and similar projects. And if you liked the video, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching, and maybe we'll see each other again in the next project.